Few things symbolized the might of the Galactic Empire during its reign and struck fear into the hearts of the Star Wars galaxy's inhabitants quite like the Imperial Star Destroyer. This versatile and imposing vessel represented the peak of galactic engineering, and it returned to a style of massive capital ship typically not seen for over 1,000 years. In today's video, we'll discuss the historical forces which influenced the development of the Star Destroyer, its predecessors, the way it fit into Imperial Doctrine, and finally, the way it fell out of favor, especially in the Star Wars Legends timeline. That's one iconic vehicle, here's another. It's the M4 Sherman of World War II fame, star of the show in our sponsor today, Sherman Commander. This is a new RTS action tank simulation hybrid game, in which you lead tanks and infantry into combat from the commander's seat across critical battlefields of World War II. You'll give out orders to fellow tank commanders, infantry squads, and your own crew, formulating a battle plan from the very center of the action, and working together against crafty AI opponents, constantly attempting to outmaneuver you. The key is understanding that tanks alone aren't enough. You must utilize infantry support and deny it to your enemies to prevail in armored warfare. Plus, as powerful as the Sherman is, it's not the apex predator of the battlefield by any means, so you need skill and strategy to see those under your command prevail. And for a more action-packed approach, you can play in action mode, where you control the tank as a whole more abstractly from a more casual third-person perspective, with less simulation and more tactical vehicle combat. Take your pick across a load of missions and campaigns. And if that sounds good, then the best news is the game is out now. Buy it now via our links in the description and take your squads into action with Sherman Commander. While records of the earliest service dates of the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer are sometimes conflicting, no doubt because of misinformation spread throughout the historical record by Imperial agents, it was certainly a product of the Clone Wars. This massive conflict saw rapid innovation in all forms of technology, but especially in capital ships. A millennium before the war's outbreak in 22 BBY, the final war between the Sith and Republic, called the New Sith Wars, concluded at Ruusan. This was followed by the Ruusan Reformation, presided over by Supreme Chancellor Tarsus Valorum, an ancestor of Palpatine's predecessor, Finis Valorum, in that same position. These reforms effectively stripped the Republic of any active military, leaving only a token judicial force. Planets were allowed to maintain their own defensive fleets, but there were significant restrictions on size and power. While ships hundreds of meters or even a kilometer long were not even particularly rare before, they were now generally outlawed. Shipbuilders in some systems sometimes skirted these restrictions, constructing massive battle cruisers. But these were legally limited in both hyperdrive grade and armament, and existed more as vanity projects and large hunks of flying durasteel, waiting for the opportunity to be refit into something more practical if a conflict arose, than as true warships. So when the Clone Wars broke out, both sides approached the challenge of building the first military the galaxy had seen in a millennium in different ways. The Separatists relied at first on refitting ships formerly used as either cargo haulers or to protect their merchant fleets. The Republic pulled together whatever judicial and planetary defense fleets they could, but they also relied on a new fleet of larger, more powerful capital ships built in secret. At the outbreak of the war, the Acclamator-class assault ship was the main new vessel of this type, measuring 752 meters long and serving in various configurations as troop transports, fighter carriers, or direct combat ships. As the war progressed, various other vessels in a similar, now quite familiar wedge shape would follow the Acclamator, and the Republic's shipbuilding efforts came largely from two competing shipbuilding concerns: the ancient and well-respected Rendili Star Drive, and the younger but ambitious Kuat Drive Yards. The competition between these two shipwrights was made all the more personal by the identities of their star designers, a father-daughter pair named Walex and Lyra Blissex. Walex was already an established ship designer by the time of the Clone Wars, having designed the Delta 7 Aetherspite for the Jedi Order. Lyra had grown up under her father's tutelage, assisting him because he was unable to use a computer. Each contributed their own personal design to the Republic's war effort, meeting the need for larger, more powerful ships of the line within the Republic in their own way. Lyra, who moved out from her father's shadow by working for Kuat Drive Yards, designed the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a 1,137-meter ship, which mixed significant fighter carrying capacity, having a fighter complement numbering in the hundreds, with a powerful armament. This included 8 powerful DBY-827 dual turbolaser turrets as the keystone, along with dozens of smaller laser cannons, 4 proton torpedo tubes, and a pair of lower-grade turbolasers. Wallach's design, made under the rapidly fading banner of Rendili star drives, resembled the future Imperial-Class more closely. This was the Victory-Class Star Destroyer, made as part of the Victor Initiative project, a name which more closely matched the convention used for the Venator and Acclamator. The Victory, which measured in at 900 meters in length, typically carried only 2 starfighter squadrons, compared to the Venator's much more sizable complement, and instead focused on anti-ship weaponry. The Victory was introduced with a loadout consisting of 10 quad and 40 double turbolaser batteries, along with 20 assault concussion missile tubes. A later model, the Victory Mark II, would swap the concussion missiles for ion cannons and upgrade the turbolasers to a higher caliber. Wallach's design would see much more limited use during the Clone Wars, although it became far more popular under the Empire. We can posit a few reasons for this. Militarily, the Clone Wars were a conflict which relied heavily on snub fighters and bombers for both sides. While the Victory was effective at battling other capital ships, it had limited defenses against fighter craft, on top of its own lack of a significant fighter complement. The Venator, conversely, had ample fighters of its own, along with point defense lasers able to protect it from incoming bombers and munitions, even if it was otherwise less capable in ship-to-ship combat ton for ton. Politically, Kuat drive yards was also generally becoming more favoured, which gave yet another edge to the Venator. Towards the end of the Clone Wars, Lyra wanted to build on her father's design and produce a new ship for the Republic, and thus was born the Imperator-Class Star Destroyer, which would come to be known as the Imperial-Class after the declaration of the Empire. This design removed the maneuvering wings of the Victory-Class and scaled it up to 1,600 meters. Its hangar space exceeded that of the Venator, although, as we'll discuss later, under the Empire, this was traditionally used to carry assets beyond just fighters. Like the Venator and the Victory, the heaviest cannons aboard the ship were in 2 rows of 4, lining the ship's superstructure. In initial runs, this included 6 double-barreled heavy turbolaser turrets, with the aftmost turret on each side being a heavy dual ion cannon. This ship additionally boasted 60 Borstal NK-7 ion cannons, 60 time and back XX-9 turbolaser cannons, and 40 laser cannons. Although it was introduced late into the conflict, it had already begun to supplant the Venator by the war's end, at least on production lines, if not on the battlefield quite yet. The first ship of the class to enter service was the Executrix, which participated in the Imperial subjugation of Kashyyyk. The second was the Extractor, which would go on to serve as Sith Lord Darth Vader's personal flagship in the early days of the Empire. Over its service history, the Imperial-Class would see multiple different configurations emerge. The earliest of these was the Tector-Class, which was designed and built alongside the earliest models of the Imperators during the Clone Wars. This configuration removed hangar space in favor of additional armor plating, allowing the prominent reactor bulb on the ventral side of the ship to become more safely tucked away than the attractive target it typically presented on the Imperial. This typically came along with a different weapon configuration as well. As the Clone Wars ended and the Republic turned into an empire, the Imperial Star Destroyer became an ever more common sight within the Imperial Navy. Lyra continued to loyally serve the Empire in the creation and improvement of warship designs, while Wallach Blissex opposed the New Order and would go on to join the rebellion in trying to destroy his daughters and his own creations. But Lyra had long since divorced her fate from her father's and had become a rising star within the Empire in her own right. Before the end of the Clone Wars, she had married Den Wessex, commander of the Venator Star Destroyer Redoubt, who then became the Grand Moff of the Relgim Oversector. The Imperial-Class became the perfect tool to carry out Imperial oppression throughout the galaxy. While it technically could outcarry the Venator in raw numbers of fighters, even during the height of the rebellion, there was not the same emphasis on regular pitched battles which were seen during the Clone Wars. Instead, much of the hangar and cargo space was dedicated to increased supplies for longer solo deployments, along with troops and materials to to establish and supply Imperial bases on a planet's surface. Most Star Destroyers carried an IM-455 modular garrison base for this purpose, along with nearly 10,000 soldiers and dozens of walkers. This typically left only 6 squadrons of starfighters, along with a wide array of troop transports and shuttles. All of this was on top of the nearly 37,000 crew required to fully staff the Star Destroyer itself. A fully loaded Star Destroyer could, depending on the mission profile, operate completely independently for up to 6 years. As the Empire worked to expand its reach throughout the galaxy, both in systems which had been members of the Old Republic and in new frontiers, a single Star Destroyer was often enough to keep the local systems in line. It's estimated that at the Empire's peak, over 25,000 Star Destroyers were in service. As important as its direct combat capabilities were, the Star Destroyers also prioritized the ability to prevent combat from arising as part of what was called the Tarkin Doctrine, also known by its detractors as the Doctrine of Fear. This doctrine relied on the widespread deployment of a heavily armed military to dissuade invasion, enslavement, or most tellingly, the fomenting of political dissent. The purpose of this wide deployment of Star Destroyers, then, was to give each system a symbol of the Emperor's power and to prevent a rebellion before it could even start, while holding enough firepower to bring down most local armed resistance if or when it arose. The Star Destroyer was incredibly effective in this context, but it was also not without its own weaknesses. A Special Operations Commando once quipped to smuggler Kingpin Talon Card that the Imperial Star Destroyers were nothing more than 174,000 design flaws waiting to be exploited. One commonly cited example of this was the exposed command bridge atop the ship's main superstructure. Additionally, while the wedge shape theoretically allowed more weapons to focus on a single target, it required the ship to pitch forward somewhat to accomplish this in practice. Luckily for the Empire, for much of the conflict, these weaknesses were purely academic, as it was rare that a Star Destroyer would need to go toe-to-toe with a similarly powered ship during most of the Galactic Civil War. Lyra's conversion of her father's Victory-Class design into the larger Star Destroyer also omitted crucial information, leading to design flaws that made the ships more expensive than necessary, and that Lyra feared might one day doom the entire project. At the height of the rebellion, Lyra and her husband even attempted to lure Walex into an Imperial trap to force him to work alongside her and rectify these issues. Unfortunately for her, this attempt failed. Certain flaws in the ship were addressed in subsequent iterations. The original Imperial-Class started to be replaced shortly before the Battle of Yavin by the Mark II. The first of these was called Empire, and focused primarily on improved shielding. The biggest hallmarks of the standard Imperial-II, however, involved the vertical conning tower of the Imperial-I being laid on its side, and the replacement of the main guns alongside the superstructure. The heavy dual cannons were replaced by 2 batteries of 4 octuple barbette turbolasers, and much of the ship's iron cannon loadout was typically replaced with additional turbolasers. One early example of this updated class, Avenger, was even used by Moff Kalast in support of rebel forces, before Darth Vader successfully trapped the traitorous Moff with an interdictor cruiser. He returned the ship to Imperial service under Captain Lorth Nida within Vader's own notorious Death Squadron. Point defense laser cannons were also typically removed from this iteration, leaving the ship more vulnerable to starfighter attacks. This proved to be a growing issue for the Empire after Yavin. The Death Star was notoriously destroyed by snub fighters approaching critical systems by taking refuge in one of the many trenches running alongside the station's surface. But similar trenches could also be found on Star Destroyers, allowing for similar tactics to succeed in damaging these fearsome capital ships. This gave rise to a pandemic known as Trench Run disease. One rebel fighter commander, Horton Salm, noted that Imp Star juices, as the Mark II became colloquially known, were particularly vulnerable to this disease, without their own fighters to cover vulnerable areas. Another rebel commander, Wedge Antilles, noted that the actual success rate was relatively low, but damaging a Star Destroyer at all was a rare thing in general, and the tactic was successfully deployed at least a few times, not just against smaller Imperial Star Destroyers, but against much larger Super Star Destroyers. The Empire tried to introduce other means to combat this weakness. The Lancer-class frigate was developed as an anti-fighter escort for the Star Destroyers, but it was never able to be produced and deployed in significant numbers before the Battle of Endor. Other attempts to introduce higher quality fighters, like the TIE Defender, saw similarly limited deployment. Ultimately though, the fall of the Empire was not because the Empire's fleet of Star Destroyers was defeated in direct combat, so it's inaccurate to pin their defeat on any single failure in military design or fleet deployment. Once Emperor Palpatine was killed at Endor, the majority of Star Destroyers, spread out as they were throughout the galaxy, began falling prey not to the Rebellion on its way to forming the New Republic, but to each other. Initially, the Rebellion and New Republic relied on their own smaller capital ships and Mon Calamari cruisers to fill out their fleets. But over time, they managed to capture many of the Star Destroyers which had formerly been in the Empire's service. Ships like Accuser and Adjudicator were captured and integrated into the New Republic Defense Fleet and rechristened Emancipator and Liberator, participating in the destruction of their former masters. Many other ships joined, not through capture but through willing defection. While these ships remained in service for decades within the flagging Empire, desperate to retain any symbol of their former glory, the days of these all-in-one vessels, built for long deployments, were coming to an end. As the New Republic began to design their own purpose-built fleet for the galaxy's defense, it found itself in need of a very different type of ship. System defense was certainly important, but where the Empire had needed a constant reminder of its power to keep systems in line, which could operate without the support of Allied facilities, the New Republic was held together by mutual agreement, and so a permanent independent deployment was rarely necessary. The deployment of these new ships was repeatedly delayed by crises caused by re-emerging Imperial leaders such as Thrawn and the clone of Emperor Palpatine. But the result was the New Class modernization program. The crown jewel in this program, which introduced several new classes of ships designed by the Republic Engineering Corporation, was the Nebula-Class Star Destroyer. This so-called pocket Star Destroyer was significantly shorter than the Imperial-Class, at 1,040 meters compared to the ISD's 1,600, with a proportionally smaller beam length and a far less prominent superstructure. This made it even somewhat smaller than the Venator-class of the Clone Wars. Despite its smaller size, it was able to bring nearly as much individual power to bear. It was equipped with 80 heavy turbolaser batteries, 20 ion cannons, 8 concussion missile launchers, and still managed to carry 60 starfighters, only one squadron short of the Imperial-class's standard complement under the Empire, given that the Empire had dedicated so much carrying capacity to supplies needed for long deployments. These fighters were typically the new E and K wings, and were individually higher quality than Imperial fighters. This also allowed for a significantly reduced crew, closer to 7,000, a far cry from the 37,000 plus ground support typically carried under the Empire. The new class saw limited deployment, given its introduction shortly before the Empire and New Republic declared peace, and there were certainly weaknesses within its own design philosophy. The Imperial-class would remain in service for both the New Republic and Empire for several decades, but that was more out of convenience, given the sheer amount of them, than a belief that they were the optimal design for the day. Some new variations would still emerge, like the Anakin Solo in 40 ABY, which equipped a classic Star Destroyer hull with new long-range turbolaser technology, but the era of the Imperial Star Destroyer's supremacy was at an end. Thank you for joining us on Wizards and Warriors for this exploration of the Imperial Star Destroyer. Please consider liking, subscribing, and clicking the bell to be notified for future video releases. These videos would also be impossible without the support of our patrons and channel members here on YouTube. You can follow the links in the description to join them and get early access to videos, our Discord, a release schedule, and other benefits.